Nvidia might be in your portfolio, even if you don't own it directly. The stock is the second largest holding in some popular ETFs, SPY, XLK, and the SOX, and it is the largest holding in the SMH. Joining us now to set the table ahead of those results, Ruben Roy, Stifel Managing Director, and Gil Luria, Head of Technology Research at D.A. Davidson. Guys, welcome. Ruben, you cover, of course, Nvidia and a bunch of smaller stuff in semi-optical comms equipment. Is Nvidia, in your view, a host unto itself, or which of these names tend to react the most to it, positively or negatively?
Thanks for having me, John. And yeah, you said it. I mean, Nvidia is part of this massive AI infrastructure spend and build that we have been witnessing over the last several years. But certainly, that infrastructure spend goes beyond one company, right? So there's a network built around these clusters of AI compute that are going into the data centers around the world, and we have a lot of thematic stocks within that framework that we like, optical component companies, system companies. And you mentioned software. I cover EDA companies, and we also think that that's a fundamental building block of semiconductor designs, and we've seen an accelerating rhythm or pace of semiconductor designs being driven by AI infrastructure spend. And so, yeah, there's a big ecosystem here, and we think NVIDIA numbers will be very important as we think about the overall ecosystem as we look beyond the first half of the year into the second half of this year.
Gil, you've got a hold, I believe, on Nvidia. Why, especially after this past quarter's results when we heard Meta and some others saying they're still opening up their wallets wider to buy stuff that's got to include Nvidia chips?
Yeah, so we think the current stock price balances the bull and the bear case. The bull case is the one Ruben presents, where if everything is fine, Nvidia should continue to grow, and therefore it's probably trading at a pretty good multiple that could keep going from here. The bear case has to do with what the outcome is for China. We really don't know how severe the restrictions are in terms of Nvidia's ability to sell into China. China is at least a quarter of where ultimately Nvidia chips end up. And all we know right now is that they had to stop selling H20s. We know the U.S. government is restricting the sales there. We know the government is trying to prevent the sales of Nvidia chips into Singapore, Malaysia, and other countries from arriving in China. So if China sales slow down from here, it's not going to be enough that Nvidia's large customers continue to buy. Amazon, Microsoft, Google, their buying is starting to plateau. Meta and Tesla are continuing to buy. But if there's weakness in the China revenue, if there's weakness in some of those other neo clouds that have to raise capital at extraordinarily high rates in order to buy GPUs, there may be downside to estimates. I would point out that Nvidia estimates were adjusted up all the way to February for 2 years. And then in February, the numbers started getting adjusted down. If the earnings tomorrow lead to further earnings adjustment down, it's going to be hard for the stock to outperform.
Ruben, we tend to spend a lot of time on Nvidia's near-term chip sales and maybe not as much on how much its software moves and systems moves are actually locking in a loyal customer base that's going to be less likely to move even as competitors try to provide a different kind of value, at least on the price line. What are you listening for on the call? How much value do you ascribe to evidence of that ecosystem growth and loyalty extending?
Yeah, it's developers, right? And NVIDIA has the widest ecosystem of developers built around their CUDA, which is essentially CUDA software, which is essentially the operating system of AI today. And so I think that's one part of the framework that we'll be listening for. But certainly networking, as I mentioned, is becoming much more important as a part of this AI infrastructure build. And NVIDIA has a lot of proprietary networking interfaces that just last week at Computex in Taiwan, Jensen Huang talked about opening up a little bit of that technology into the broader ecosystem of compute, AI compute that goes beyond GPUs. And so yet another way to potentially monetize this vast portfolio of technology that the company has built up. But to Gil's point, certainly China is something that investors are going to be watching for as a potential risk. But I'd also mention that in addition to hyperscale spending, which continues to trend upward, not at the rates obviously that we've seen potentially over the last 2 years, but we are starting to see sovereign nations, sovereign governments, and other entities starting to come into the mix here. The Saudi Arabian Public Fund, Humane, talked about a big build with Nvidia. We saw the UAE version of Stargate being announced last week. So I think there's a lot of spend coming, and we're just now ramping the initial Blackwell infrastructure out there in rack scale designs. And I think that's got a lot of legs behind it as we look into the second half of this year.